For 44 years, a family waited. A daughter murdered in 1979, her killer walking free, living an ordinary life just miles away from the crime scene. The evidence was there from the beginning, locked in a tiny sample of DNA, but the technology to read its secrets didn't exist yet. Then, in 2024, everything changed. What happened next would bring justice to dozens of families and revolutionize how we solve the unsolvable. This is the story of how modern science is finally giving voices to victims who waited decades for answers. Imagine being a detective in 1979. You arrive at a crime scene where 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez has been found murdered just off Highway 243 in Riverside County, California. You collect evidence meticulously. Blood samples, fibers, anything that might help. You run every test available at the time. You interview hundreds of people. You follow every lead until they all run cold. And then, with no way forward, the case file gets placed in a box, moved to a storage room, and the years begin to pile up. 1 year becomes 5, 5 becomes 10, 10 becomes 20, and still nothing. This was the reality for countless families across America. But what those 1979 detectives didn't know was that the microscopic evidence they carefully preserved would one day become the key to solving cases they thought would remain mysteries forever. They couldn't have imagined that the DNA sample sitting in their evidence locker would eventually speak louder than any witness ever could. Fast forward to 2018, and everything changed with a single arrest. In Sacramento, California, a 72-year-old man named Joseph James DeAngelo was taken into custody. He wasn't just any suspect. He was the Golden State Killer, one of the most prolific and terrifying serial criminals in American history. Between 1974 and 1986, this man had committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries across California. For more than 4 decades, he had been a ghost, a phantom who seemed to have vanished into thin air after his last known crime in 1986. But here's what makes this story absolutely groundbreaking. DeAngelo wasn't caught because of a tip or a confession or traditional detective work. He was caught because investigators used a revolutionary new technique called forensic genetic genealogy. They took DNA from a decades-old crime scene, uploaded it to a public genealogy database called GeneMatch, and found his distant relatives. People who had submitted their own DNA to trace their family trees had unknowingly helped catch one of America's most wanted criminals. Think about that for a moment. Someone, somewhere, trying to learn about their ancestors, uploaded their DNA to find out where their great-great-grandparents came from. They had no idea that their genetic information would be the missing piece in a puzzle that had stumped law enforcement for over 40 years. The DNA match didn't point directly to DeAngelo. Instead, it identified people who were his third or fourth cousins. From there, genealogist Barbara Ray Venter spent 4 months painstakingly building family trees, searching for where different family lines intersected, looking for a man who would have been the right age and lived in the right places during the crimes. When they finally narrowed their search down to Joseph James DeAngelo, investigators placed him under surveillance. They waited until he discarded a tissue, collected it, and tested the DNA. It was a perfect match to the crime scenes. The ghost finally had a name and a face in 2020. DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. After 44 years, the families of his victims finally had answers, but the Golden State Killer case was just the beginning. What happened next has been nothing short of a revolution in criminal justice. Since DeAngelo's arrest, over 400 cold cases have been reopened using genetic genealogy. In 2024 alone, dozens of cases that had been unsolved for decades finally saw closure. The technology that once seemed like science fiction has become one of the most powerful tools in law enforcement's arsenal. Let me tell you about some of these cases. In November 2024, the Riverside County Cold Case Homicide Team announced they had finally identified the killer of Esther Gonzalez, the 17-year-old girl murdered in 1979. Using forensic genealogy, they identified Lewis Randy Williamson as her killer. Williamson had died in 2014, escaping earthly justice, but after 45 years, Esther's family finally knew who took their daughter from them. Her sister Elizabeth expressed mixed emotions, grateful for closure but saddened that the perpetrator would never face trial. That same year, Illinois investigators determined that serial killer Bruce Lindell had murdered Kathy Heil in 1979 in Idaho. The Ada County Sheriff's Office closed their investigation into the 1980 murder of Mary Tracy after DNA results identified Charles Nicholas Strain as the highly probable suspect. Strain had died in prison in 2007. In Oklahoma, police solved the nearly 50-year-old murder of Lilla Johnston using DNA genealogy, identifying a man named Charles Droke, who was himself murdered years earlier. Perhaps most remarkable was the case of Mary Schlaze, a hitchhiker stabbed to death in Wisconsin in 1974. For 50 years, her case sat cold. Then, in 2024, DNA testing led investigators to 84-year-old John Miller. When police arrested him at his assisted living facility in Owatonna, Minnesota, the investigator who worked the case emphasized that this wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about justice for Mary and allowing her to be remembered not just as a victim, but as the accomplished artist, equestrian, sister, and daughter she was. The science behind this revolution is fascinating. Traditional DNA testing, the kind you see on crime shows, uses what's called short tandem repeat analysis. It's incredibly accurate for matching a suspect's DNA directly to crime scene evidence, but it requires an exact match already in the system. If the perpetrator's DNA isn't in the database, you hit a dead end. That's where hundreds of thousands of cases stopped cold. Genetic genealogy works differently. It analyzes hundreds of thousands of DNA markers across the genome, the same markers that ancestry testing companies use to tell you about your ethnic background and find your relatives. When crime scene DNA is uploaded to genealogy databases, it doesn't need an exact match. Instead, it finds relatives sometimes as distant as third or fourth cousins, people who share great-great-great-grandparents with the unknown suspect. Here's what makes this so powerful. Research published in the journal Science found that when a genealogy database contains just 2% of the adult population, more than 90% of people of European descent will have a third cousin or closer relative in that database. GEDmatch, the database used in the Golden State Killer case, contained less than 1 million profiles at the time, representing only about 0.5% of the U.S. population. Yet it was enough to crack cases that had been cold for decades. Since 2018, specialized forensic labs like UTHREM in Houston, Texas have emerged, focusing solely on partnering with law enforcement to solve cold cases. Companies like Parabon Nanolabs and teams like the DNA Doe Project have made it their mission to give names to the nameless and justice to the forgotten. Genealogists like Barbara Venter and Cece Moore have become pioneers in a field that didn't even exist a decade ago, using their skills to build family trees that lead to killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder. The impact goes beyond just solving crimes. For families who have waited 20, 30, even 50 years for answers, this technology brings something money can't buy: closure. Dan Westland, an investigator in the Mary Schlace case, put it perfectly when he said they didn't want people to forget that this was about justice for Mary and bringing her family peace. Each solved case represents a family that can finally move forward, knowing the truth about what happened to someone they loved, and the technology keeps advancing. In 2024, investigators can now extract viable DNA profiles from evidence that was previously considered too degraded to test. They can work with samples that are decades old, exposed to harsh conditions, or contaminated. Cases that were considered completely unsolvable just 5 years ago are now being reopened with renewed hope. But this revolution isn't without controversy. Questions about genetic privacy, the ethics of using ancestry databases for law enforcement, and the rights of people whose relatives submit DNA have sparked intense debate. Critics argue that people who upload their DNA to trace their family history never consented to helping solve crimes. Supporters counter that solving murders and bringing serial criminals to justice outweighs privacy concerns, especially when dealing with violent crimes. What's undeniable is that we're living through a transformative moment in criminal justice. The technology that was once the stuff of science fiction is now solving real cases, bringing real closure to real families who have waited far too long for justice. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. Right now, somewhere in America, there's an evidence box sitting in a storage room. Inside that box is DNA from a crime scene, maybe from decades ago. And thanks to the technology we've talked about today, that DNA might finally be ready to tell its story. A family that's waited years for answers might finally get closure. A criminal who thought they'd escape justice might finally be held accountable. The future of criminal justice is here, and it's written in our genes. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We dive deep into true crime cases, scientific breakthroughs, and the stories that change our world. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Should we be using it more? What are your thoughts on the privacy concerns? I read every comment and I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want to see more content like this, give this video a like. It helps more people discover these incredible stories of science, justice, and the families who never gave up hope. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.